Hello, my name is Professor Shiladitya Rakshit. Suggested Solution to Refugee Problems is the name of the module. Introduction. Various solutions to refugee problems are different in their aims, implications, application, and timeline requirements. Some solutions are in response to emergencies, while others aim at long-term redressal of the issues. There are a variety of global organizations which aim to help and assist refugees and which have constantly come up with new solutions to refugee problems. Some of the most influential organizations are the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the International Refugee Organization, the International Rescue Committee, and others. This module looks at some of the most widely implemented solutions and analyzes their pros and cons. Learning outcomes. To give students an insight into various proposed solutions for the refugee problem, by the end of the module, students will have an understanding of the viability of a few of the most popular and widely suggested solutions. Suggested solutions. Resettlement in third country. A few refugees can't go home or are unwilling to do on the grounds that they will face further persecution once they do so. Many refugees are also living in risky circumstances or have particular needs that can't be tended to in the nation where they have looked for shelter. In such circumstances, the most viable option of such refugees is to be resettled in a third country. This arrangement is sometimes the only practical and long-term solution available. Countries like the United States of America, Australia, Canada, and the Nordic nations have taken an active part in the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, that is UNHCR's, resettlement programs. Other Europe and Latin American countries have also come forward in the recent past. The civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights similar to those enjoyed by nationals are accorded to the refugees by these nations. This is in addition to basic legal and physical protection. In all practicality, they allow refugees to become naturalized citizens. However, many a times, the drastic change in society, language, and culture make the process of resettlement extremely hard on refugees. For such cases, it is extremely beneficial for both the refugee and the receiving nation that the refugee be provided facilities like cultural orientation seminars, language training, and programs to enable them to access education and employment opportunities. Government and non-government organizations play an important role in providing these facilities. The UNHCR members show that only around 1% of all refugees are ever resettled in third countries. Recipient countries' control over the selection of refugees has given way to introduction of criteria like religion, which are not in accordance to the UNHCR's policy of assessment of refugees' need for protection. Another scathing criticism of this process is that the resettlement process has been distorted by taking the refugees' economic capabilities into account. This has led to allegations that the resettlement process has been exploited as a source of cheap labor for developed countries. Nevertheless, due to the work put in by the UNHCR and NGOs from around the world, resettlement has become a viable option for as many as 1,40,000 refugees. Increased efforts have been made to simplify procedures and increase countries' capacity to receive refugees. Despite various complications, third country resettlements is a viable option for many refugees. Repatriation, voluntary or forced repatriation, going back home, remains the most coveted and durable solution to the refugee problem. However, repatriation requires the highest levels of commitment from the country of origin towards the protection and reintegration of these returning refugees. It is of great importance that refugees are aware of all relevant details before they decide to go back to their country of origin. The possibility of further violence and extortion upon return should be considered. The availability or lack of legal aid, basic necessities and sustainable means of livelihood should be integral to a refugee's decision about repatriation. International law also recognizes the right of a refugee to return to his or her country of origin. Article 13, Clause 2 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and return to his own country. This has created a universally accepted code of conduct. No country can deny its citizens the right to return. There is also an emphasis of the voluntariness of repatriation. The principle of non-refoulement dictates that the involuntary return of refugees to their country of origin amounts to refoulement. This is in the context of the fact the refugee is by definition someone who has a well-founded fear of persecution in his home country. Hence, many organizations and instruments stress on the voluntary nature of repatriation. This also extends to the refugee's right to correct information. It is not permissible to curb voluntary repatriation by providing false information about the likelihood of persecution upon return or false promises of continued assistance in the country of refuge. Moreover, voluntary repatriation poses a very viable and durable solution to the refugee problem, precisely because of its voluntary nature. The true voluntariness of decisions must also be assessed. For instance, the presence of positive circumstances in the country of origin which compel the refugee to return should be favorable. Presence of negative circumstances in the country of asylum should not be a favorable reason for voluntary repatriation. Similarly, reasons like returning to prevent loss of property in the homeland are not persons which should be the basis of one's decision to return to one's homeland. It is also important to ensure that the refugees return safely and with dignity. This entails a number of factors like ensuring refugees aren't harmed physically en route when they are received or after they have settled. Family unity should be prioritized and all steps should be taken to prevent the separation of family members. The responsibilities of the host nation are integral to this process. Host nations are bound not to return refugees to places when there is a clear threat to their lives. The host country must also facilitate the assimilation of information regarding the conditions in the refugee's home country and the communication of the same to the refugees. The host country, with assistance from the UNHCR, must also help facilitate refugee visits to their home countries, so that they themselves can assess the situation there and make an informed decision about returning. The country of origin should also cooperate in this process. It must take steps to enable the safe and dignified return of its citizens. They must ensure that all refugees are granted their nationalities again, including any non-national spouses or children born in the time spent as refugees. They must also provide bodies like the UNHCR unrestricted access returning refugees so that a proper analysis of their conditions can be made. Only when these steps are formally followed can the process of repatriation be smooth and functional. Local assimilation. For many refugees across the globe, there is little or no chance of returning to the country of their origin. Constant conflict and fear of persecution make it impossible for these people to return home. The next viable option for such refugees is to set up home in the country of asylum. Local integration is the way forward for a large percentage of refugees. Successful local integration entails the grant of legal, physical and material security along with the chance to lead a normal life. In a numerous long-term refugee circumstances, local integration can be a practical and profitable arrangement that advances the human security of both the refugees and the host nation. The proof for this is that self-settled refugees who greatly outnumber officially settled refugees get by without relying upon any authority's assistance, by depending on their own genius, the backing of the local groups and access to job opportunities in the district. Local integration may be coveted and promoted by host governments when it is seen as a source of economic development of the host nation. Host nations can enable this positive result by encouraging refugees to undertake financially beneficial tasks and by permitting them the rights and freedoms which international law prescribes to them. These rights and freedoms would enable them to work and be financially productive. Freedom of movement, for instance, empowers refugees to leave their camps and find work. This work may be the same as they practiced before displacement or menial tasks like physical labor. This makes them a source of productivity and integrates them in the local economy. Further, as a part of the process of comprehensive integration, refugees could be offered access to land and to social services which are at par with nationals like unemployment agencies and recruitment agencies. This way, host governments and the UNHCR could bolster, encourage refugee financial activity, which would eventually be advantageous to both the host nation and the displaced people. Efforts must also be made to accustom the refugees to local culture, languages and practices. Any form of discrimination against these refugees must be discouraged, especially racism. They must be made to feel at home, and only then can they be truly integrated into the society. Local integration is an extremely viable alternative to living in refugee camps on a long-term basis. Its success, however, largely depends on how the local country and its people react to the refugees' presence. If favorable, these refugees can turn into valuable assets for the host nation. International burden sharing. Of burden sharing in relation to the refugee crisis is well recognized by the international community. The demand for burden sharing is based on the rationale that mass influx of refugee places unduly overwhelming weights on specific nations, and an acceptable fix cannot be attained without global participation. Hence, states should be called upon to assist overburdened states as a show of solidarity. They should take all required measures to ensure that no country is overburdened by a mass influx of refugees and left to deal with the situation by its own self. This is especially important as refugees causes great strains on the host nation's economy, environment, and peace attempts. Given that majority of refugees are in developing countries who already have weak economies, it is imperative that they receive assistance from the international community. This assistance goes a long way ensuring that the host country meet its obligations to the refugees, also ensuring their safe return. The sudden influx of a large number of refugees creates demand for food, energy, transportation, employment, and public services such as education, health, and water facilities. This causes huge economic strain on the region. Moreover, there is a huge environmental impact with the sudden rise in need for fuel, water, and land. It threatens the ecosystem as a whole. Hence, the principle of burden sharing is essential for viable sustenance of both refugees, camps, and host nations' interests. Depending on the situation, burden sharing may encompass anything from provision of human resources, temporary admission of refugees to their permanent resettlement. It is also advisable for countries outside the affected region to step in to offer support. This will lighten the load on all nations in the affected region. Tackling the root cause. Increasing number of wars and intensity of violent conflicts give rise to the largest number of refugees. Bad governance is also another contributor to refugee numbers. With a lack of basic necessities in the home country, abject poverty, insecure living conditions, social inequality, fear of being persecuted, and danger of violence, people have no options other than seeking refuge in other countries. There are two ways of looking at the source of these problems: focusing on the internal aspects or the external aspects. Often, while addressing these issues, the major focus is on internal aspects like governance, intrastate violence, and societal norms, amongst others. This approach is often criticized with the claim that it ignores relevant external aspects like colonialism, unfair trade regulations, global inequality, the impact of transnational corporations on the local economy, and the environment and arms trade. Since international refugees bodies like the UNHCR and the International Refugee Organization IRO have no mandate in many of these aspects, it is imperative that the states involved themselves take an active role in addressing these issues and solving the refugee problem. A popular solution proposed to the refugee problem is the advancement of economic standards in the countries of refugees' origins. Improved conditions will help mitigate the pressures faced by people in these countries and reduce their outflow. These target conditions can be achieved by well-directed investment, more equitable trading arrangements, a reduction of the debt burden, and intelligently used development assistance. Attention should be focused on seeking long-term solutions for the refugee problem and not short-term accommodations. The UNHCR and similar bodies can play a role in this pursuit by stressing the need for such solutions to the international community. The UNHCR can be explicit and direct with their expression of the problem with the current strategies adopted by nations. Detailed negative consequences of economies and policies should be pointed out. An analysis should be carried out of the policies which worked for states in which the refugee problems have diminished and which have actually gone on to receive more refugees than they used to send. Advocacy of the importance of human rights is also a must for the UNHCR. Propagation of democratic values, conflict prevention, and peaceful resolution of disputes go a long way in mitigation threats to the physical security of citizens. This in turn reduces the need for people to emigrate. The most powerful states of the world should make an additional effort to address these issues. The UNHCR should emphasize the need for them to do so by making detailed analysis of the impact they have on the world economy and consequently on refugee movement. Generally, these countries are faced with a large number of asylum seekers. Attention should be brought to the fact that if these countries help create better economic conditions and refrain from causing international conflicts, the number of unwanted people seeking asylum in their countries will reduce considerably. A major demand made is for these countries to stop the supply of arms to groups of people who are persistent on creating unrest in other countries. In conclusion, the refugee problem is one which almost every country in the world faces as a recipient of refugees or as a source of the same. There are many ways to tackle the refugee issue and they must be applied to situation based on proper analysis depending on the situation. Developed countries have the most important role to play in this process. Small contributions from developed countries across the world will go a long way in helping poorer countries in times of crisis. It is imperative that all efforts are made to solve the refugee problems as it poses one of the most major threats to human rights at present in the world. Groups like the UNHCR have done commendable work and should continue to do so. With more assistance, the refugee problems can become a shadow of the formidable issue it presently is. Thank you.